One of the most fundamental concepts that you're going to be picking up in your studies of human physiology is the concept of homeostasis. So homeostasis is more or less just your body's attempt to make sure that everything inside, composition and status of things like your blood pressure and your blood glucose, stay the same in spite of outside conditions changing. For example, your body temperature should usually be about 37 degrees Celsius no matter what the weather is outside. It could be really hot outside or it could be really cold outside. Homeostasis is going to ensure that your body temperature hopefully stays constant in spite of wildly changing outside conditions. So in terms of what homeostasis does, this can depend on a number of different things, particularly what it is we're interested in. So we have a number of different homeostatic parameters that are going to be kind of fluctuating, and we will have separate homeostatic mechanisms for each one of those. For example, your body temperature is one such parameter, and when your body temperature rises too much and gets too high, we have homeostatic mechanisms to bring it back down. When your body temperature gets too low, we have homeostatic mechanisms to bring it back up. So it doesn't have to be just body temperature. It can be things like blood pressure, blood glucose, composition of other things in your blood like sodium, potassium, and other electrolytes. It can be a number of different things, and the whole point is that we have homeostatic mechanisms for each one of those to make sure that they all stay within a permissible level. So even though we have separate individual homeostatic mechanisms for each one of those parameters, the nice thing for us as we study this is that you can break down each homeostatic mechanism and strip it down into a number of different components. And these components, thankfully, can be found in every single mechanism. So a homeostatic feedback mechanism that will act to correct any problems will always start with some kind of a stimulus. So your stimulus might be, my body temperature is too high, my blood glucose is too low, my blood pressure is too high, etc. So generally it's going to be something's too high, something's too low. So for our example moving forward, let's say that your blood pressure is too high. So in this case, our stimulus is going to be our blood pressure is just too darn high. Okay, so you can appreciate then that your stimulus is going to be basically something's wrong, right? So something's wrong, we need to fix it. But as you've likely noticed in the real world, where things of course always go wrong, something can only be fixed if someone notices that there's a problem to begin with. So how does your body do this? There's a problem, but we only know it's a problem if somebody notices it. So that's going to be where the sensor comes in. Sensors in your body are basically groups of cells whose job it is to monitor this parameter, in this case blood pressure. For blood pressure, we have sensory cells that exist in your major arteries and then also in the medulla in your brain. And these sensors are constantly monitoring your blood pressure, even when it's at a normal level, constantly monitoring this so that when it does get too high or does go too low, it's able to notice right away, and then it can start organizing a response to bring it back to normal levels. So physiologically speaking, what a sensor actually is a little bit complicated, especially because this is usually the very first thing that is introduced in a physiology class. So we're not going to go into too much detail right now, but we will cover eventually, as we move through our study of human physiology, we will be able to appreciate what the sensor actually is. But for now, it's enough to know that your sensor is going to be receptors that exist on, let's call them sensory cells for right now. So we have these cells that have these receptors, kind of like little antennae, and these antennae are constantly monitoring whatever our parameter is. In our case here, we're monitoring blood pressure. These receptors are little antennae that are constantly getting a sense of what the blood pressure is, so that when the blood pressure gets too high or too low, we know right away, okay? So we've got a handle on what our stimulus is, what's gone wrong. in that case, blood pressure is too high, and we've got a sense of how we're going to notice that the blood pressure is too high. The difficulty with sensors, or rather the drawback of sensors, is that they're very capable of noticing that there's a problem, but they're not quite so good at doing anything about it. So the sensor isn't going to be able to himself bring the blood pressure back down. He can only notice that there's a problem to begin with. So the sensor, thankfully, knows that this is bigger than him or her, so he is going to tell someone who is more capable of doing something about it. So if you look up here, the sensor is going to send what is called an input signal to an integrating center. So there's a few things to cover here. An integrating center is basically a big processing center in your body that is capable of receiving incoming information and then passing outgoing information about the input. So to put this more simply, the integrating center is receiving information about the problem, receiving information that the blood pressure is too high. The integrating center will process this information, decide on the best course of action to fix that, and then your output signal is going to be basically instructions on how to fix this. Okay, so let's catch up here. Your input signal is going to be an electronic signal sent through neurons, and that is going to be the basis of the input signal. So this is a neural signal sent to the integrating center. Okay, so then we know that that input signal will be received by the integrating center. So if you've been kind of looking ahead, you're probably aware that, okay, the integrating center most often is going to be either the brain or the spinal cord. So it's going to be some component of the central nervous system. But the interesting thing here is that even though most of the time a component of the central nervous system will be your integrating center, it's not always the case. So endocrine glands can also act as integrating centers. So that will be a topic for another time. Okay, so keeping up here to catch up, our stimulus is that our blood pressure is too high, correct? Okay, blood pressure is too high. We need to notice that there's a problem to begin with. The receptors on those sensory cells are going to receive this information that the blood pressure is too high, send an input signal to the integrating center, basically a message to the brain, spinal cord, etc., a message detailing what the problem is. And now the integrating center is going to receive this information, process it, and then send an output signal to what is called an effector. So even though the integrating center is pulling a lot of different duties here, receiving information about the problem, processing it, and sending that information back out, the integrating center isn't actually directly solving the problem. It's only receiving information, sending information back out. So your effector in this case is going to be the tissue or organ that is directly capable of fixing the problem. So our output signal, just as the input signal was, our output signal will be a neural signal. Except in this case, the neural signal is sent from the central nervous system, if it's our integrating center, to the effector. So in this case, your output signal goes from the integrating center to the effector. With the input signal, the signal was going from the sensor to the integrating center. So it's important to understand the difference between an input signal and an output signal. Okay, this leads us to the case of, okay, what's our effector? So in the case of blood pressure, and this is something that you will likely cover as you progress in your studies of human physiology, but the best way to think of effector is basically, it's the thing that's capable of fixing the problem. So the effector in this case is going to directly cause a response. And appropriately, that's what comes next. The effector is going to lead to some response. And if we played our cards correctly, our response should be antagonistic to what our stimulus was. If our stimulus was that the blood pressure was too high, our response should be to bring the blood pressure back down. So if we bring the blood pressure back down, then the problem that was there to begin with is going to gradually go away. If our blood pressure gets a little too high, we go through this whole rigmarole here and eventually bring the blood pressure back down. We're getting rid of the problem that was there to begin with. And this is nice because these types of loops are called negative feedback loops, meaning that they tend to shut themselves off once the problem has been fixed. So if you see here, your response, which is that the blood pressure comes back down, we say that it has negative feedback on the stimulus. Keeping in mind that our stimulus was that the blood pressure was too high, so that really if we bring the blood pressure back down, the stimulus goes away, the sensor no longer detects any problem, the sensor then will no longer send an input signal to the integrating center, will no longer have an output signal, the effector will stop receiving information to do stuff, and this whole thing will just naturally shut itself off. It's a really, really, really intricate and very well-designed system of making sure that when things go wrong, we fix them and then we don't kind of overshoot our landing, as it were. If it wasn't for that negative feedback mechanism, if we start out with our blood pressure being too high, the response would continue on and on and on. We would bring our blood pressure down and down and down to the point where we get the blood pressure too low. The fact that the stimulus eventually goes away because of our negative feedback loop ensures that we decrease the blood pressure only to our specified limit. We don't want to decrease it too much. So if you actually want an example here of what one of these mechanisms might look like, and specifically when it gets turned on and when it gets turned off, let's look at an example here where we're tracking someone's blood glucose. So blood glucose here we have in blue, and you can see that, and you can also appreciate that as you go throughout your day, you go through periods where you eat a meal, go several hours without eating, eat a meal, go several hours without eating, your blood pressure is going to fluctuate a little bit, right? So if you consider this right here, we have a case where your blood glucose starts to fall. These red dotted lines are meant to indicate the normal range that we want blood glucose to be in. If we go above the red line, blood glucose is too high and we'll need to do something to fix that. If we go below the red line here as we are, we need to do something to fix that too. So our response is going to need to be something antagonistic to what the stimulus actually was. So in this case, we have an example of your blood glucose getting a little too low. So once we cross that threshold of that bottom red dotted line, we are going to turn some homeostatic feedback loop on. So when that feedback loop is on, you'll notice that the blood glucose starts to climb back up. But like I said, we don't want that loop to stay on for forever, because that's going to increase and increase and increase the blood glucose until it gets too high. So you can see that once we restore blood glucose back to our desired threshold, the whole mechanism will shut itself off and we will get blood glucose back to where it needs to go. So hopefully this has kind of given you a starting point and hopefully an appreciation for just what a homeostatic feedback loop actually is. And you'll want to make sure that you kind of hang on and store in your mind what all of these things are, because we are going to see them again and again and again and again as we go throughout our studies in human physiology. So once we get more information on the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, and things like that, you'll be able to appreciate much more what the sensor is going to be, what the input and output signals will be, and especially what your integrating centers are. But since this is likely going to be your introduction into human physiology, for now it's okay to just think of these things as they are presented right here.